Hi, everyone. So, welcome to the second short lecture from, chapter 3 now in your textbook. We began this chapter by talking a little bit about the Industrial Revolution and how it affected people's notion of time and space. And we're going to continue with that theme here and talk a little bit about time and the industrial worker. So, specifically, what we see again with the Industrial Revolution is a shift from an agrarian or farm based economy to an industrial society. And this altered the way that people experienced work, right? Work became very different in many ways. We've already talked about the fact that up until the late 1800s, the idea of working for someone else was viewed with contempt, right? It was viewed as un-American. It was against the notions of freedom that were expressed in the Constitution. And so it didn't just change it in that way, it also changed our experience of time, and it led to a much greater emphasis on time. Time became much more important. And the scholar E.P. Thompson has written extensively on this. And Thompson proposes that the change, the major or defining feature of the emergence of industrial capitalism was the change from what he called task time to clock time. So this is an important distinction. Task time is really just how long it takes to do something, right? How long it takes to complete a task. And this is different than clock time, which is time as it's dictated by the clock. So you can understand, if you lived prior to the Industrial Revolution and you were a farmer, and it was time to go out and plant seeds. You woke up, you went out, you planted these seeds, and it took you as long as it took you, right? It took as long as the task took, right? It takes you as long as it does to do the work, right? And that's task time. But when we switch over to an industrial economy and people are going to work in factories, they're thinking about time in terms of clock time, right? I got to clock in at 8 a.m. and clock out an hour for lunch, and then clock back in, and then I get off at 5 o'clock, right? And it's just about how many hours of work you put in. It has little, if anything, to do with the actual amount of time that it takes to complete a task. And so Thompson says this is really the defining feature of the emergence of industrial capitalism. As the modern era came on and people switched to working in factories, we changed the way that we thought about time. So again, with task time, it can be shaped by a whole bunch of things, external factors as well, right? So if you're out there and you're planting seeds, if we go back to our farmer, then you can work from sun up till sundown, and nature affects task time. If it takes you 2 days, that's because you can't plant seeds in the dark, right? It can also be shaped by factors like tides, right, for fishermen, and seasons for farmers. If it's spring, you plant corn. If it's I don't really know. I don't know anything about farming, but you get the idea, right? So this is one of the fundamental changes in the way that we think about time that came with the Industrial Revolution. So work in and of itself and the routine of work really kind of changed as well, right? Before we had factories, life was all about just bits or bouts, little periods of intense labor, and then idleness, sitting around, right? So if you had to mend a fence on your farm, right? You'd go out and you'd mend that fence, you'd fix it, right? And then maybe you were done, right? And you didn't have anything else to do for the rest of the day. So what we see is that when you go to work in the factory, however, right, you're expected to work for 8 hours or however long your shift is, right? So prior to the factories, people worked as they needed to work. So this is one of the things that the critics of our capitalist system now bring up a lot, right? If you go back to hunter-gatherer societies, for example, we find that people worked many fewer hours in order to keep themselves fed. They had a lot more free time, believe it or not, right? Today, everything's dictated by clock time instead of task time. Even our classes are dictated by clock time, right? We meet for an hour and 15 minutes or whatever it is twice a week, right? And many people would argue that that kind of school schedule, or even the schedule that you have, in elementary school, where you have to get there by a certain time, you eat lunch at a certain time, and so on, is just training to work in a factory or work in the in the modern economy, right? It's a form of ideological brainwashing. Many people argue, right? So people used to just work as they needed to work, and there was no real thought given to the idea of combining work with private time, right? Work and leisure were all part of the same, right? It was all part of the same time. So if you made wagon wheels, well, your workshop was probably connected to your house, and you'd go out from work for a while, then you'd come in and eat lunch and sit around and talk to your spouse for a while, and then you go back out and work for a while more, and then maybe you go play with your kids, right? So there was no set work schedule unless people wanted there to be a set work schedule, right? They just worked when they needed to. And so work and personal life sort of blended into one another. Now, what this meant was that for early industrial workers, a lot of the struggle between those workers and their new employers was about time, right? There was concern that time was there was a, how do I put this? There was a misunderstanding, as I indicate here, right? There's a difference between time as past rather than spent, right? People had to suddenly think of time as money. And this wasn't really something that people had thought about before. Now, you've obviously heard this phrase hundreds of times in growing up. Time is money, right? People didn't used to think about time in that way. And they also weren't used to the idea of being paid for their time rather than completing a task. If your job was making barrels, you got paid for the number of barrels you made, not the amount of time you put into it, right? But all of a sudden, you were being paid for each hour you spent at work. Now, in that scenario, obviously, it's in the best interest of the employee to go to work, not work that hard, but be there for a long time to get paid the most amount of money that they can. So that's where the struggle comes in, right? The employer wants you to work fewer hours and churn out as much work as possible. And for you, it's in your best interest to work the most hours and do the least amount of work possible. And that's where some of the fundamental tensions or conflicts arise, especially for the early industrial workers. Now, one of the ways that employers dealt with this, and one of the ways that they sort of policed or regimented or controlled time, was initiating the system of clocking in. This was first done by Josiah Wedgwood in the United States, and he had people come into work and literally punch the time clock, right? And so he was the first one who's responsible for that. So if you have to go to work at any of your jobs and clock in, you can thank Josiah, right? And so he came up with this idea of regimenting people's time and keeping very close track of it through clocking in. And industrialists, the people in charge, the people who own the factories, recognized that schools were something that they could use in order to train future workers in the discipline of industrial time. That's where we get this idea of, you got to show up at school at this time, and from 8:30 to 8:45 you have homeroom, and then from 8:45 till 10 o'clock you have social studies, right? All of that is about regimenting time, about organizing time in a way that honestly is beneficial to employers, right? That's beneficial to the people who hire us. And I mean, many of you, by the way, are attending school. I ask my classes all the time when we meet in person, why are you here, right? And the most common answer I get, 99% of the time, is I'm here so I can get a job. Now, that's fine, but you need to realize when you say, I'm here to get a job, I mean, you're admitting to the fact that you're just there to train to benefit someone else, right? I mean, it's not so much about expanding your mind or benefiting you as a person. When you say, I'm going to school to get a job, you're basically admitting that you're there to train to make somebody else money. And, that's okay. That's how our system works. But when you really sit about it and you think about it critically, which is what this course is about, right? A critical approach. You need to realize that you're really there to benefit someone other than yourself, if that's your ultimate goal. And I suggest to you that that's kind of screwed up, right? So time, in any event, is essential to the development of industry. We know that people have to be there during a certain period of time. It's essential. And it also helps to control workers. And in particular, it helps to control workers who are used to a sense of autonomy or working for themselves, right? Being on their own. So time was one of the ways that we disciplined these folks and got them in line, right? By controlling their time. Interestingly, and this is true today, if you think about it, the more professional, quote unquote, the job is, right? The more status a job has, the less control we find over the person's time, right? So if you have a job that's not prestigious, right, or not really of high value culturally, chances are your time is very regimented. So if you got to clock in and clock out, right? It's not. You probably are not working at a job that's prestigious or considered very professional. But if you get to become, no one's watching the CEO of a company to see whether or not he clocks in or clocks out, or she clocks in or clocks out. That shouldn't be gendered. If you go to law school and you become a lawyer, right? I mean, no one's making you work shifts. So, again, ultimately, I suggest to you that what you want to aim for is a job where other people don't have control over your time. All right, so that's it for this short lecture. Next time, we'll talk about the emergence of scientific management. Thanks for checking this out.